right, welcome to the second day and third session of the Spring Creativity Conference. This is the central division of the Societies for the Philosophy of Creativity, and the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity is also helping out with this, as they do with a lot of the programming here at the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought. So that's an awful lot of acronyms: the FPC, the SPC, the AIPCT, and then there's COVID-19. So years from now, they'll be watching. All of which are represented here. Yeah, that's years from now they'll be saying, "What is COVID-19?" Yeah, right at the moment it's even meaner than the objects that Kevin Taylor is going to talk about. So our spring conference is on the cultural power of personal objects. How it is that various things that we don't normally think of as persons come to take on the power of having personality, maybe even actually having personality, maybe even actually being persons. I tend to be the one who pushes as hard as I possibly can in the direction of full personhood for everything. Full personhood for everything, for the banana, for the microphone, even for Kevin. Kevin Taylor got his Ph.D. at SIU in December 2017. Wrote his dissertation under Douglas Berger in Japanese thought, and studied Asian thought more generally, which was something we used to do at SIU. We used to do a lot of things at SIU, but he now teaches at the University of Memphis, and therefore many people envy him because it's a pretty good gig to get out of graduate school, and so anyway. Actually, Kevin's paper was one of the things that started off the volume, which is now under consideration at SUNY Press, on the cultural power of personal objects, and these papers are all chapters in that volume. But we were all at your place in Cullowhee, North Carolina, Western Carolina University, 3 summers ago? Well, two full summers and almost another, because one's coming now. And a group of the people who were giving, the topic was Indian personalism and Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
And it just turned out that paper after paper raised this issue. And so finally I was like, there should be a book about the cultural power of personal objects. And so Kevin's was one of those papers, and so we're really pleased that his paper is in the volume, and also that he's here to give it today. So Kevin, take it away.
Well, I'm sort of studying under Doug Berger, who does Indian and Chinese thought, and then going to a conference on India and Schopenhauer. Naturally, I have to say, can I do not those things? Can I do Buddhism and Japanese culture? Right. But they all have their roots in Indian philosophy, and so I'll start off with a brief introduction about that. But part of the way that this paper comes about is my interest is in environmental thought and classical Japanese Buddhist philosophy, especially Japanese Buddhist engaged Buddhism responses to the environment. And it's been, as you said, a couple of years since we presented these papers, and this has given me some more interest in revisiting this paper and saying, this was a good paper when I first visited it, but now I feel like it could probably double it in length and give it a much more thorough treatment. So most of this is a revisiting of what I've talked about before, with some additional pages put on at the end, and a little bit open-ended at the end as well. And to sort of echo the sentiment that I heard from yesterday, I wasn't necessarily pleased with the title. So if you have some suggestions for titles, I'm very open to listening. With that said, I'll jump into reading the paper. Excuse me. So Japanese religious philosophy is a syncretic tradition. That is, it blends all the other traditions into themselves. So you can't really, after a while, talk about Buddhism or Shintoism without reference to one another, let alone Confucianism, Taoism, or any of the other cultural factors that played a role in its development. This paper focuses on Japanese animated household objects known as Tsukumogami. This subject matter involves kami, spirits associated with later developments of Shintoism, but the folklore scroll that introduces Tsukumogami is itself of Buddhist origin. But even here, the first line of that scroll attributes belief in Tsukumogami to an unknown text called the Miscellaneous Records of Yin and Yang, and one of the principal characters in the scroll is Confucian. By focusing on animate objects in the Tsukumogami scroll, sometimes referred to as simply the Tsukumogami key, this paper becomes situated in the Muromachi period, which is 1336 to 1573 when that scroll was written, And later I'm going to be jumping into the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, with another similar scroll, which is, this is a time period that is politically Confucian and religiously Buddhist, but never without these strong Taoist and Kami presences. Since Kami and Buddhism are closely intertwined, it will be necessary to give some philosophical development to fully appreciate the difficulty in sorting out these Buddhist elements. I will then discuss the role of Kami in terms of persons and then objects, with some acknowledgement of the Buddhist role in this development. It was, after all, a scroll intended to demonstrate the superiority of Buddhism over Kami worship, but in so doing, Buddhism amplified and popularized a normative approach to object veneration in the wider Japanese culture that does continue to persist today. It's my hope that this paper demonstrates that the ways in which we treat objects as alive enrich and reorient our praxis to intensify personal experience. I'm on board with you. So a little background of the development of Buddhism, and some of this you may at some point ask yourself, why am I talking about all these things in so much, I tried not to put too much detail on it, but almost all of these things that I introduce along the way do come back throughout the paper in some ways. Buddhism as a product of Indian philosophy carries with it many cultural, religious, and philosophical assumptions. But the linchpin for a radical break from the Brahminical tradition rests mostly on the notion of Atman or Anatman, self-no-self distinction. Whereas Indian philosophy was largely concerned with the eternal, unchanging self, known as Atman, Buddhism rejected the concept and posits that everything is subject to change and impermanence. Therefore, there is no Atman. There is no eternal self. As Buddhism began to flourish, its teachings moved east into China, where strong Confucian tradition was already well established. And here the story could have ended because the Confucian worldview is strongly unsympathetic to Buddhist notions of a life characterized by suffering. The emphasis on reincarnation and the all too frequent accusation that Buddhism is world-renouncing. However, Taoism is often credited with the successful promulgation of Buddhism among folk religions, with Buddhism and Taoism borrowing and co-opting texts from each other. In the 4th and 5th century, when Mahayana was introduced to China, Taoism, despite its long history, is still developing as a folk religion. Sympathetic to the teachings, Taoism provided a way into China. However, as the scholar Christine Molière notes, identical usages of sutras and literary works variously plagiarized by both Buddhist and Taoist texts. There were some Buddhist texts that were written, and then the Taoists co-opted them and called them Taoist texts, and the Buddhists did this the other way around. Christine Moliere's book is called Buddhism and Taoism Face to Face, and it's just simply a selection of how they're basically plagiarizing each other. But it is a mutually beneficial way, because Taoism gets stronger as a result, and Buddhism is able to take root in China and continues to learn about this power of co-opting and syncretizing with other religious traditions. Slowly, various Buddhist sects took root in northern and southern China, while Buddhism first entered Japan in 552 AD. Kukai's study of Chinese Buddhism from 804 to 806 was the first among several defining moments for Japanese Buddhism. Kukai founded esoteric Shingon Buddhism, which is by and large the focus of this text. The Tsukumogami key is a Shingon text. And on a companion ship, he was sent from Japan to China on 3 ships. One of them had Saicho on it, who is the founder of Tendai Buddhist philosophy. Weather sinks all of their ships except for Kukai and Saicho's. Saicho would later be the founder of the exoteric Tendai sect of Buddhism, which has a more influential, which is more influential and occupies a very privileged space in Japan, setting up on Mount Hiei at the capital, out of which all of the Muromachi sects emerge. So Dogen's Zen, Nichiren's Zen, Nichiren's sect of Buddhism, Honen's Pure Land Buddhism. They all come from Saicho's Tendai school as a break with some of their teachings. Now, Saicho was the first to use this term Mokuseki Busho, which is the Buddha nature of trees and rocks, in Japan, but Kukai had substantially greater contribution, which would promulgate through future students coming out of the Tendai sect on Mount Hiei. So they were contemporaries with each other. In fact, Saicho was trying to learn some of the esoteric teachings from Kukai, but he wouldn't go physically face-to-face with him. He was trying to learn through correspondence. And Kukai Shingon is fundamentally an embodied practice, and Saicho either didn't want to show up face to face, or didn't quite understand that it was such an embodied practice, and Kukai eventually shut him down, said, "I'm not going to be able to teach you anymore unless you show up here." So Kukai and Saicho mark a significant development in Buddhist thought from India to Japan. Indian Buddhist practices insisted that Buddha nature was something that we attained through hard work and spiritual development. So we have the potential for it if we study and practice really hard. Kukai and Saicho introduced the concept of Hongaku, or original enlightenment, arguing that all sentient beings already have Buddha nature, and it's just the process of recognizing that we have Buddha nature. Insofar as our interdependent relationship with others and nature can at any time be authenticated by perceiving the world from a non-discriminating mode of awareness. The extent of Hongaku thought varies from thinker to thinker. I frequently say when you're asking questions about Buddhism, it depends on whose Buddhism you're talking about. And that's going to apply for different articulations of Hongaku thought. In the Japanese Buddhist cosmological view of reincarnation, which they borrow from India, it's known as Rokudo, or the Six Paths. Only the human realm can attain Buddha nature, whereas those in the Akudo, or the evil realm, or sometimes translated as the unfortunate realm, must improve. I once at a conference referred to it as the evil realm, and I was shot down very quickly from a more advanced Japanese scholar who says, evil is a Western word. It's more unfortunate. For me, this is problematized by the fact that one of the main villains in Samurai Jack's name is Aku, and he is literally an evil demon. But granted that it will be the unfortunate realm, which still mimics hell. So,
well, Buddhist idea of existence as suffering can also be existence as disappointing.
Oh, yes. Yeah. The entire problem with the world is disease, but if you put a hyphen between that, dis-ease, then that is the character that life is hell. Life is unfortunate and suffering. So, let me see. The notion of the unfortunate realm, we have to improve our karmic merit in order to be reborn into the human realm. So if you're in one of those three unfortunate realms, you have to rise up to the human realm. But if you have too much good karma and you're in the realm of the gods or the warrior titan spirits, well, you have too much good karma. You have to drop down into the human realm because that's the privileged position where Buddhist enlightenment can be had. So Kami and the concept of Rokudo find themselves at the whims of a rapidly dominant Buddhist tradition. They don't really fit into that cosmology, so Buddhism, incorporating the concept of Rokudo, gets to decide where they put Kami in this. As early as 901 AD, the term Honji Suijaku, which means original ground, manifest trace, was employed to explain the relationship between the Buddhist deities and the local Kami. The term was codified by the majority of temples during the Kamakura period, 1185-1333, and it was understood that the kami were manifestations of Buddhist deities, resulting in a temple shrine complex where the kamis and Buddhas were worshipped side by side. The kamis are protectors of the Buddhist deities, so they serve the Buddhists. This interpretation came to be questioned by Tendai monks later on and inverted Honji Suijaku as nationalism rises in Japan throughout much later on. The Buddhas are manifestations of the kamis protecting the Shinto tradition. As I mentioned, that happens later on, about the 1900s, when state Shinto comes around. A little bit earlier, too, when they start cracking down on foreign influences. Until now, I've avoided using the term Shinto because in the timeline that I'm talking about, the word Shinto didn't really exist as a word in and of itself. It was mostly folklore, local kami worship. The term Shinto developed from a simple word meaning the realm of the kami into a more sophisticated concept meaning the kami way in the course of the medieval period and evolved into an autonomous religion system from there. So although these things existed for quite some time, they didn't feel a need to systematize it and call it a religious tradition in and of itself until other traditions like Buddhism and Confucianism kept vying for control at the capital. And in the face of this, Shintoism essentially was forced to develop and systematize itself into one thing. The text I will be referring to, the Tsukumogami key, is dated to have originated from that Muromachi period, when a unified Shinto would be transforming and therefore not widely understood as a religious system. The advantage is that the particularist centrifugal pantheon of the kami has always stood in opposition to all centralizing concepts, be they Buddhist or Shinto. Such an approach should have to highlight the dynamics involved in a text that comes from a background of Confucian governments, Buddhist religion, kami culture with some Taoism and some yin-yang elements, also known as onmyodo, all throughout. So you'll see these things come up when you're studying in that time period, and it's not always easy to tell them apart, and sometimes you have to consider the source. So this is dealing with the Buddhist text, so it's dealing with the Buddhist superiority. But what's nice is in that opening paragraph, you get the recognition that they're all in one pot together. We are talking about yin-yang, Confucianism, Shintoism, Buddhism, all existing in one group. So that's sort of your historical background. Now, according to kami worship, kami express themselves in the human realm as natural objects like rocks, trees, animals, and as man-made objects like tools and everyday artifacts. Kami can be humans as well, such as Emperor of Japan or Sugawara no Michizane, who was alive from 1845 to 1903. That puts him at 58 years old. Michizane was a famous poet and scholar who served the previous emperor until he was deposed and exiled in 901. After his death 2 years later, 903, plague and drought and the sons of Emperor Daigo died in quick succession, and lightning repeatedly struck the palace as rainstorms flooded the city. These events were attributed to the angry spirit of Sugawara to the imperial court. So the imperial court built a shrine dedicated to him and later deified him as a kami, Tenjin-sama, a kami of scholarship with many shrines dedicated to him today. Of course, not all kami are so grandiose as to be striking the temple with lightning and killing off the emperor's sons. Ancestors are said to become kami. The Yasukuni shrine is said to enshrine 2.5 million kami. So the people who died from the war, their ashes are put into the shrine, and you get the mingling of individual kami into one mass kami that cannot be separated, which complicates a lot of the issues between Japan and the rest of the world for when the spirits of Yasukuni shrine are being venerated. And they say, well, you have war criminals in there. Because of the mixing of the kamis, you can't separate them out. So be careful what you put in the pot. You can't take it out. Kami in a variety of shapes and kami come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but kami are generally understood to be expressed in objects that are particularly striking, such as an ancient camphor tree or Mount Fuji, for example. These are objects that inspire awe. I can't not read that line and not think Kant. Not only does nature find itself imbued with kami, but the line blurs between man and nature with kami and man-made objects. This gets us to Tsukumogami, animated household objects. Introduced in the Tsukumogami key, the record of the tool specters, a Tsukumogami is a type of yokai or monster. Sometimes it's translated as monster, spirit, goblin, ghost, demon, phantom, specter, fantastic being, lower order deity, or some other numinous monsters. When an object becomes 100 years old, it is said to attain a spirit and become an animated object known as a Tsukumogami. And the word Tsukumogami is also considered to be a homonym. So one translation, depending on what characters you use, translates it as the animated household object. Another one translates it as 99 hairs, as in an old woman at the age of 99 has these long gray hairs, and it's evoking that you are about to turn 100 years old, and it's suggesting that 100 years old, it becomes an animated object. So, as yokai, Tsukumogami are not quite kami and not quite oni or demons. And this is attributed to a demarcation between these three types of spirits. I got a little bit of a block quote for you here. Orikuchi Shinobu suggests that there may have been no clear demarcation between oni or demons and kami in Japan's ancient past. Both were awesome beings, although the oni may not have been worshipped. Orikuchi asserts as well that the negative and fearful aspect of kami came to be considered oni. He writes that the oni concept before the introduction of Buddhism was a variation of tokoyo kami, kami who live in the other land and the land of the dead, or marebito, foreign travelers or kami who visit villages, who give blessings on the lunar New Year's Eve and on New Year's Day of the coming year. Komatsu Kazuhiko explains that supernatural deities worshipped by Japanese are known as kami, while those who are not worshipped are called yokai, hobgoblins, monsters, what have you. And the yokai with the most negative sense are oni. So you worship kami, you don't worship oni, and somewhere in between that power dynamic, you might have yokai. The concept that a 100-year-old object can develop a spirit of their own was an outgrowth of kami worship and reverence for objects in sacred spaces, but was also connected with a practice from the late 10th century year-end house cleaning event known as Susu Harai. This is spring cleaning. The text, the quote for this goes, Susu Harai is not only a large annual house cleaning event, but also part of a preparation ritual for the welcoming of a Shinto god of the coming year, or a harvest god. It is the day to remove the accumulated misfortunes of the year, as well as to expunge one's defilements or crimes. Throw away all those things that embarrass you, maybe. An entry for the 6th of the 12th month of 1236 of Azuma Kagami, the Mirror of the East, 13th century text, records the Susu Harai event at the Kamakura military court. It also recounts that Susu Harai activities were not carried out in newly built residences for about 3 years. So they have some time to accumulate. Later commoners are said to have followed this custom. Now, the Tsukumogami key was written to promote Shingon Buddhism, and we can see the blending of kami worship and Buddhist beliefs throughout the text. Shortly after these objects are discarded in the scroll, they begin speaking amongst themselves. They've been thrown out onto the curb of this busy city, and they start complaining. Angry at the extravagance of the wealthy families for receiving no reward for their years of service, they begin talking about revenge.
Sounds like Toy Story 4.
4 is the one I have not seen yet. Ichiren, the Buddhist rosary that they threw out, concedes that the human owners treated them with hostility, but tries to dissuade them from taking revenge on humans. He insists this must be our karma. I guess he would be the Woody in the Toy Stories. The objects reject Ichiren whole cloth, but listen to Kobun Sensei, the professor of classical Chinese literature who is depicted as a hand scroll. Kobun Sensei explains some principles of animism via onmyodo, this yin-yang theory, and leads them to kami worship and the practice of Confucian virtues. So he is deviating from the Buddhist norm in this text, which is going to be presenting this as a cautionary tale for why Buddhism is superior. One day, a Tsukumogami says, Japan is a divine country where everyone believes in Shinto. This, despite the appearance of the word, it would not have been pronounced Shinto at that time. While we have already received our forms from the creation god, we have not worshipped him. And this is as if we were non-sentient beings like trees or rocks. I propose that we make the creation god our patron and worship him, that we will be sure to have a long life with abundant prosperity. So they're talking about worshiping this other non-Buddhist deity with roots in some Chinese religious traditions, specifically yin-yang tradition and some Taoist traditions. Living outside of Kyoto, the Tsukumogami begin to take their revenge. They rob, they kill, they eat all kinds of animals and humans. The Tsukumogami cruel actions lead to an intervention by Buddhist deities who offer them the opportunity to convert to Buddhism. Not so much an opportunity as convert to Buddhism or we destroy you. In the end, the Tsukumogami return to Ichiren, who teaches them Buddhism, and they all eventually attain samadhi. Every good Buddhist story is they successfully attain enlightenment. The record concludes attributing specific tools to specific Buddhist deities in that nature of Honji Suijaku. So these animated household objects come from very, very specific objects, and then they attribute some of them as protecting certain Buddhist deities. It also states that whereas some sects advocate only Somoku Jobutsu, the enlightenment of plants, the teaching of the three mysteries of Shingon alone goes so far as to say Somoku Hiju Hoshon Susho Jobutsu, plants and non-sentient beings become Buddhas by arousing the desire for enlightenment and performing ascetic and religious practices. The Tsukumogami key was a story to promote Shingon Buddhism, portraying Chinese philosophy and kami worship as legitimate, although inferior to Buddhist doctrine, and rival Buddhist sects as inferior to their narrow views on Buddha nature. So not only is this better than the foreign religions, but it's also better than the other sects of Buddhism out there. The idea of animated household objects continued into the early 16th century in the form of Hyaki Yako Amaki, the illustrated hand scroll of night processions of 100 demons. Although the key in this Hyaki, the 100, could also be written as, or pronounced as Hyaki Yagyo, the night procession of 100 tools. This is another homonym. Japanese language is full of homonyms, and they're almost always intentional. So it could be translated, depending on the character you use, as demon, or if you choose another character, literally as tool. So you can play around with the language when you're translating this text. For anyone interested in the differences in characters, I have the character for Oni here and the character for tool here. In these scrolls, animated household objects parade at night and wreak havoc on anyone who crosses their paths. While the Tsukumogami key singles out extravagant families as the source of their anger, the popularity of Tsukumogami, a popularity that's enjoying a resurgence even today, may have been a byproduct of the increase of commerce and industry. Komatsu Katsuhiko speculates that perhaps because people were becoming more separated from nature with their increased production, they started to believe that tools not treated with respect would come to life and seek revenge. Many people in medieval Japan apparently believed that man-made objects can possess a spirit, and that tools must consequently be handled with reverence. The attitude still survives, at least to some extent today. I am a martial arts instructor. I teach and use a samurai sword, and just about everyone who knows anything about samurai has heard the term that this is the soul of the samurai. A modern-day ritual known as Ningyo Kuyo collects unwanted but not unloved dolls in a kind of a mock funeral. Prayers and thanks to the doll for years of the fond memories. Even though the dolls are not Tsukumogami, a ritual is performed to purify and drive out the spirits within them. Both Shinto and Buddhist sects perform this ritual, so this may have started out as a Buddhist ritual, because Buddhism tends to perform funeral sorts of rituals, but it's also, this particular one is done by both Shinto and Buddhist practices today. The general perception is that you need rituals to be done to help the passage of the spirit from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead, and also to separate the spirit from this realm to free them from the confines of the item that they've been born into. And also that ritual practice of thanking them for their service. You would think that within the Tsukumogami key that maybe if they had given them a proper ritual to sort of send them on their way, that maybe that would have helped and they wouldn't have wreaked so much havoc. The Japanese reverence for objects is commonly exemplified in katana, teapots, calligraphy brushes, but also in more mundane items, pencil boxes, shoji, the sliding wall screens, and umbrellas, all of which have been represented as animated objects at some point. The umbrella monster is one of my favorites. It just looks like an umbrella with one eye on the top of it and a clawed foot at its base that would hop around. More than just religious justification, there's also practical reasoning behind the reverence for objects. Shoji are delicate paper scrolls, so you don't want to slam them. You want to treat them gently and nice. You get a lot of rain in Japan, so if you go and visit a shop, you'll probably shake off your umbrella and put it in a rack at the front door. And if someone walks off your umbrella, you don't get too attached with that. You'll just take somebody else's umbrella that's at that door. But it's something that you need because it's an island country with a lot of rainfall, so give reverence to the umbrella. It's helping you out throughout your day. The personality of these animated objects is often related to their intended purpose. So Ichiren, being a Buddhist rosary, was a monk. Kobun Sensei was a scroll. In other tales, the swordsmith Muramasa, the two famous swordsmiths in Japanese history, Masamune and Muramasa. And if you play Japanese video games, Final Fantasy, things like that, these are usually the most powerful weapons at the end of the game, a Masamune or a Muramasa. Usually Muramasa is the second most powerful, and the Masamune is the most powerful weapon. They continue doing that. Muramasa, in other tales, the swordsmith Muramasa was thought to be unstable and bloodthirsty, traits that were said to be passed on to the blades that he made. His blades eventually fell out of popularity after Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu's father and grandfather were killed by Muramasa blades, and even he Tokugawa Ieyasu was cut by a Yari blade while simply inspecting the weapon. A little too dangerous, so let's take those off the market. What becomes difficult in analyzing tales of animated objects is delineating their intended meaning from their unintended meanings that take on a life of their own as they increased in popularity. The Shingon priest may tell us that these tales employed folk religion to attest to the exceptional power of the Buddhist sects and their superior understanding of Buddha nature as opposed to other Buddhist sects. But in telling the story, they also caution against carelessly tossing away objects because spirits inhabit everything around us, and they must be treated with respect. Muramasa could transfer his instability to the blades, thus perpetuating a negative karma throughout the generations. But this Buddhist message is communicated with this strong kami worship foundation. Part of what's at work here is what Lafcadio Hearn calls this cult of craft. Guild apprentices adopted not only a craft into the... Guild apprentices were adopted not only into a craft, but also into a cult. In Japanese religious traditions, the word cult doesn't have the negative connotation that we typically associate with it. Guilds of weavers, weapon makers, and other tradesmen were affiliated with worship of a tutelary deity. So if you're making weapons and armors, then you might be worshiping one of the war deities. According to Hearn, the servant could not dare to forget the presence of the deities of the cooking range, the hearth, the cauldron, the brazier. The sewing girl was taught to respect her needles, and in samurai families, the warrior was commanded to consider his armors and weapons as holy things. There's a little bit of a distinction between Muramasa transferring part of his psyche into the weapons of making them, and then the samurai who takes the soul, the weapon, and it's the soul of that samurai. So there's a little bit of blending of the craftsman who's instilling some of his personality into the sword, and the person who owns and uses the sword perhaps for generations, making it the soul of that particular family. So which soul is in that sword? My belief would be it's going to end up being a combination of the two, and if it's in the family for generations, then it would become dominated. The scholar Odate Toshio states that the objects created by craftsmen have a soul and describes a ritual dedicated to spirits of their tools. He writes, "At the end of every year, the shokunin, the craftsman, cleans and oils his tools. My master and I would honor our tools on New Year's Eve with a simple gesture that was a traditional way to thank our tools for their hard work on our behalf and for the crucial part they play in the craftsman's life." So not only treating them well, but showing them respect and thanking them for their work. Religious practices related to trade crafts continue to this day along similar lines of the aforementioned doll burning ritual. Other fire and funeral ceremonies relate specifically to trade items. Sewing needles, in particular, are frequently turned over to Shinto and Buddhist shrines. Sometimes they are burned, other times they're dull, they're not so sharp, so they're not a very good tool anymore. So to sort of put them in their little coffin, they plunge them into a block of tofu to make it easy for their last duty.
Didn't they make their needles out of bamboo, though?
In the past.
Yeah.
Let me see here.
So that's retirement.
Yes.
Retirement.
A comfortable
Yeah,
retirement.
Jim is headed for his tofu.
It's a nice soft pillow. So I have argued in the past that this reverence for objects can be understood with the concept motainai, meaning both what a waste and don't be wasteful. It's the recognition of the intrinsic goodness of an object, and if you throw it away carelessly, then it is a sad thing to see that happen. Kenyan activist Wangari Maathai, who passed away just a few years ago, described motainai as including the 3 R's, recycle, reduce, reuse, and then she added a 4th one, respect, to it. She helped popularize this concept of motainai globally and has contributed to a resurgence of motainai in Japanese cultures, which is also bringing back this recognition of this reverence for objects and Tsukumogami. Indeed, the Buddhist proclivity for frugality permeates through their monastic tradition, and one of the unintended consequences of Shingon Buddhist tale of Tsukumogami is what becomes a normative environmental ethic to mindfulness of material goods that make it meaningful. The Tsukumogami scroll start as a Buddhist text to emphasize the superiority of Buddhist teachings over local kami worship. In so doing, they demonstrate the strength of the syncretic tradition, which incorporates all those other different traditions. The Tsukumogami scroll also becomes a cautionary tale, warning us that tools and treasured belongings are more than mere items. Kami worship was intended with household objects and the crafts of tradesmen so that 100-year-old objects develop a soul, but so too did the objects invested with care by their creators, the dolls. Contemporary Japan is seeing a resurgence in these concepts with the popularization of things like motainai as an environmental ethic, both reviving old notions of ensouled items and reminding us that culturally speaking, this belief never actually went away. Thank you.
I have a question. Let's say I've used something and I know that someone else could now use it. I'm done with it. Do you have a funeral first and then give it and then it has a new soul with the new person?
No,
or do you pass it on as is?
You could pass it on as is. This
And
is
that
for the
doesn't-
end of its life.
Okay, and that doesn't become a problem, like they were maybe attached to me and not happy about going to another house?
Well, generally speaking, it wouldn't be a problem, but maybe if you're giving away, your kid's treasured toy or doll, that might be an issue, whether for the kami or for the kid.
Okay, alright. Just
But,
curious.
but
how that might
I
work.
could see that being a problem. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Carrie and I have both been working with Marcel Moss's. The idea of the gift is really a kind of a curse, because if you do give it away, then it has to be
treated according to whatever the conditions of the giving were. There's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to a gift in many archaic cultures. But this would be a much more advanced that probably the old gift giving. Well, everybody knows a gift is a kind of a curse, but so that doesn't really go away. But it looks like these are much more sophisticated, like cosmological acts. So, giving away a kami, are you cursing somebody if you give away a kami?
Well, if it was a yokai of some sort,
or even one of those demons, so marginal being, or
yeah.
Would everybody know if you gave them one? I mean,
there are considered to be some particularly auspicious items. Japan is very much so a gift-giving culture, and they tend to be things like sweets and fruit snacks, things that you would devour. So I was actually recently given a gift from one of my undergrads who studied Japanese, and it's this. It is a token to ward off evil. So that is clearly coming from a Buddhist tradition. It's also a sign of saying thanks, but it doesn't have that kami element in it, except insofar as a talisman of protection or what have you. I don't know about giving someone an umbrella that turns out to be a yokai. There could be. There's tons of folklore stories out there. I would just have to find the right example for it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I was thinking, because you talked about The Grudge yesterday.
Yes.
The potential for this for horror movies. Cause,
They've all already been made.
no, in Western horror movies, you get, like Chucky or... but these are...
Lord
or
Poltergeist.
Devil Doll, which is less known from the 60s. But
I think the recent one is Annabelle.
Yeah, but that's usually somebody's soul that gets trapped in, human soul that gets trapped in the object. Or you go back and you have the golem that doesn't have a soul, but it's not a person.
Yeah.
But here you're talking about, these things develop a soul.
Yeah, and that's the thing I've been trying to tease out is, are they saying that a kami is developing out of nothing, or that after 100 years a kami comes along and says, ooh, nice house, like a hermit crab?
Well, like, I was thinking of Spirited Away.
Oh, yeah.
The little creatures that are carrying the coal.
Yes.
Those
are susus. Yes,
they exist as long as they have the job.
Yeah, they are the sprites. Their name comes from the Susu Harai.
Okay.
Yeah, I love those things. And when she takes their job away from them, they sort of give up and let her carry the coal. And that some of them get a little mad. The Hamaji, the boiler keeper, it's like, you can't just take another person's job.
Right.
Which is a very Japanese concept.
They come into existence with their job, right?
I think so, yeah. Because most of my experience with the soot sprites are in the 2 movies that Miyazaki uses them in. I can't remember what the other Miyazaki movie where he's got soot sprite. Totoro.
Okay.
They're living up in the rafters of the house because nobody else is living there. But when they move into the house after about a week, they go, "Oh, these people are not going anywhere," and then they just move on, float away in the breeze.
No, but to go back to the. I can't think of any Japanese horror films, though, that have evil objects.
Well, they actually made a movie about the Tsukumogami, a 1960 movie, and then they redid it in 2005 called The Great Yokai War.
Okay.
It's got like a 6.1 on IMDb. So.
Okay, I want to keep going.
Yeah. So the first one is sort of a live-action movie, and it brings in a lot of these famous yokai, the Kasa Obake, the umbrella demon. And not a lot of the monsters in this movie are animated objects. Some of them are just the various different kinds of monsters, like the kappa, the turtle with the dome, with the bowl of water in his head, who likes to do sumo. A long-necked vampiric woman. There's the slit-mouth woman is a relatively new invention. People are, well, you know it right now. People walk around sick with the masks on. And in Japanese culture, she's a product of like the late 1800s. More of a horror story to little kids. They see this pretty woman with the mask on, and she says, would you like to see me smile, or something like that. And she pulls the mask off, and it's just cut open, and she's got sharp fangs, and chase the kids or kill the kids. But there are several of these that are animated objects. I keep going back to the Kasa Obake because he's my favorite. But there is the Nurikabe, the wall that is itself an Obake. So if you find yourself maybe walking through an alley in Japan on your normal path home, and all of a sudden there's just a wall blocking it, your first thought is, I must have took a wrong turn somewhere, when in reality it might actually be a yokai standing in your way. In the late 1800s, during the Meiji period, when they're westernizing, one of the professors at Tokyo University was trying to get Japan to westernize a little bit more, and he wasn't happy with all the people still attributing these folk religious beliefs. So in order to get rid of this, by the way, he studied some Kant, Hegel, and Spencer. He was instrumental in developing their philosophy department, in fact. Inoue Inryo was his name. In order to explain this away, he would tell a lot of these folk stories and serialized articles in the Yomiuri Shimbun. So you would frequently see this professor's articles showing up in the newspapers. And he would explain some of the stories like, my friend woke up in the middle of the night and he sees this giant monster standing in the hallway. And it terrifies him at first, but he tries to engage with it to scare it off or to see what's going on, only to realize it's a stack of straw and coal piled up, and he laughs it off as, I'm so silly. And these are the ways that he's trying to get people to get rid of their folk beliefs, when you can imagine in reality it was having the exact opposite effect. Because he's perpetuating...
Now these things are everywhere.
Yeah. He's perpetuating these stories and sort of explaining it that these are where they come from and there are reasons that we think that way, to the point where later in his career he just gets known as Yokai Sensei or Professor Monster. And he sort of comes around to it and becomes like,
I guess I am.
Yeah, I'm the folklore guy.
You guys said...
your description of the funerals for dolls with the dogs running extremely made me think of the Aibo, these little robotic dogs that Sony had built. They were really innovative, very popular briefly when they first came out, but the market kind of died out.
Yeah.
So Sony stopped supporting them, they stopped offering repairs, new parts. And it turns out that years pass that a lot of elderly folks had bought them, or the families had bought them for the elderly, so they're very attached to these little basically toy dogs.
Yeah.
They start dying off, or eventually just kind of reaching the end of their lives. And so there's a Buddhist temple that would hold funerals honoring the love that the owners had felt for the robotic dogs, but there was another kind of weird layer that was added because local repair shops were cannibalizing pieces before the funeral was held. So
there's your horror story.
The robotic dogs basically were like accruing merit because they were helping other robotic dogs and their families.
Oh,
Very nice.
Wow.
Well, and that makes me think of the old Tamagotchi toys. They were basically little keychains with a digital pet on there, and everyone's who had one has this horror story of I stopped feeding it after a while, and if you turn it on, it's got a sad face on it because you're forgetting about it. But those same dogs are being employed in Japanese and other Asian cultures for robot care ethics. So they would be making these dolls, putting them in elderly homes to. I think the doll that they're using right now is this baby seal. So it's very adorable. Japan's very good kawaii culture, the culture of the cute. So part of what I'm really interested in is seeing how these concepts could possibly evolve in the future in Japanese culture, that maybe we can get, robot yokai or maybe different sorts of Tsukumogami existing purely in an online space, code that has been forgotten, or your website that goes debunked from 20 years ago, maybe at 100 years.
Russians have already developed those.
Oh.
And they're deploying them.
Maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, one of the things that was interesting to me was the preciseness of the 100 years. I mean, I agree that there is something magical about a century or something. I mean, partly because it's the far extreme of what a human being can live to be.
Yeah.
And we know it's possible, but it rarely happens, that sort of thing. But an object somehow survives that long, has been passed down a couple of generations, usually by that point. And then it almost has to find a new home. It has to be rescued, right? And so I'm wondering whether or not that sort of magical mark has to do with, so I keep this because it was my grandfather's, but my great-grandfather I didn't even know. Right?
Yeah.
And in all likelihood, I didn't know my great-grandfather, and so this was his, and it's like, what is that to me? It's like, you got to get past that threshold, right? If it's somebody's great-grandfather, nobody alive knew him, right? And so now it's just an old watch, or now it's just an old, whatever it was, unless it has some personality of its own, and it's maybe not the duration, but maybe it was the way it was made to begin with, or something like that enables it to last past the threshold of memory, which I think is probably what that 100 years is.
Yeah.
It's the threshold of memory. And so no one around remembers the origin of this thing exactly. I was told. And so now its story becomes, so the narrative that's attached to it, but then, of course, this is a house full of lost objects, objects without stories that Gay and I just pick up all over the world in places like, what the heck is this? But it vibrates, and it's like, well, that needs to go home with us. And so all these objects in here, there are many of them that have passed the threshold of memory. I mean, look at the convocation of monks over there. Those are all over 100 years old, and they come from dozens of different places. Apparently, monks used to carve those things in Mexico at the various monasteries. But every time we see one, we rescue it from whatever. Why? I don't know. It vibrates, and it's past the threshold of memory. It doesn't have a story anymore, but something about it.
Well, and I would wonder how much of this is connected to sort of ancestral veneration, because there's a lot of going back to the past in Japanese culture. A lot of religious traditions do this, but there's the ancestor veneration, and then one of the three great fears of Japan, and I tend to get one of them confused or wrong: earthquakes, I want to say fire or volcanic eruptions, and I believe the third one is old men. So in one story, it could be remember and respect the past, and the other one, it's that old things are sort of scary because old age, death, and dying, and that maybe these old objects, are sort of a reminder of that impermanence. So I'm getting sort of a mixed message of, are these objects for veneration, or are these objects that in the Buddhist tradition might be just reminding me of my impermanence?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know, but we know when we see one. Juan Chindoy, who studied at the same time you did, he comes from a family of native shamans in Colombia. And the first time he walked in this house, he said, "Oh, you really invited the spirits in here." That was literally the first thing he said. It's like, "Oh, I'm surrounded." But in a way, the way I look at it is, if we rescue them, then they'll like us, right?
Yeah.
So generally speaking, I don't think we've been attacked. There's actually one that I might show you at some point that I'm creeped out by, that I want to stay away from. I put him in a cage. But I couldn't leave him where he was. So, yeah. Anyway.
I've just
Joanna?
the sword.
Oh, yeah.
I was curious, especially about the code. I've got turning that over in my mind, the idea of code taking on a spirit. But where is the balance point between the essential nature of the object, the creation of the object, and then the use of the object that, would bring something into that?
Well, so my focus on this area has been the understanding of Buddha nature. So Shingon and Dogen, in his form of Zen, talk about Buddha nature as everything that's a phenomenal object. So, everything on this table, toothpicks and what have you, all represent Buddha nature. So that's an extreme example of it, but it's the one that I've actually been exploring in terms of Buddhist environmental thought. But the original notion of Buddha nature was white human men, well, no, not white, human men, because women were not initially factored into the Enlightenment prospect. It's not that way in Siddhartha, it's not that way in Dogen, but other people come along and say, no girls allowed at some point. Mm-hmm. So there was the original male Buddhist monks could become enlightened, and then when I started talking about Rokudo, too much good karma is too bad for you. You have to be reborn as a human. Too much bad karma, you have to be get out of. By the way, the first unfortunate realm is the animal realm, so they're in a form of hell according to the Buddhist tradition, which frustrated me as the environmental Buddhist. Why did they have to be so judgy on my cats and dogs? But my emphasis on this has been, since this is a Shingon scroll, a Buddhist scroll, who are they letting in and who are they keeping out of the conversation? So it begins to take on the form of sentient beings. So, Peter Singer comes along and says, okay, I got a problem with that. But then it extends, so animals slowly become to be accepted in some Buddhist traditions, which becomes living plants become accepted in some traditions, which then starts to branch out and say, well, why are we leaving out the table? The table is a living thing. It's an object. So when you get around to someone like Dogen, all phenomenal things have Buddha nature. It's just simply the matter of realizing it, and his realization is different from other people's realizations of it. So in talking about when these things develop, these kami, it's both the Shinto conversation and the Buddhist conversation going on. And because most of the kami worship is, the things that have kami in them are these things that inspire awe in them. And Buddhism sort of co-opts it and says, well, we have this cosmological view of our own, and we absorb your religious tradition into ours, sort of, the Borg Star Trek reference, you will be assimilated. So, and their description, they put them in their very own unique place as well. They're not quite kami, they're not quite those other things, but they develop through our psychospiritual attachment to them, sort of imprinting on them. And this is the question that I don't have the answer to of, are they developing whole cloth on their own, or are they coming along and inhabiting these objects? But there do seem to be those emotional connections with it, which again is ironic from the Buddhist tradition, which is saying non-attachment. So it's sort of keying off of the Japanese kami culture and coming along and saying, we need to practice non-attachment, and if you listen to us, then we will help you with the problems that you are creating for yourselves. And this becomes more of a problem 1950s, 1970s, post-World War II Japan, where it becomes much more commercial, much more the economic boom that they have. That sort of triggers a resurgence in some of those older traditions where people are afraid that they're losing some of those old beliefs. They're westernizing too fast. So I'm pretty sure that I did not answer your question.
It's okay.
Well, it's the nexus of these. I think you actually hit something that's really crucial there, because there's this sort of tension between attachment and non-attachment.
Yeah.
You have to be really careful about becoming non-attached.
Yeah.
Right, and that would be peculiarly Japanese, right? Because non-attachment, that's Buddhist through and through, regardless of your tradition.
Yeah.
Right, and so the Japanese version of Buddhism goes, yeah, be careful about that. That non-attachment thing, that can come back to get you.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, if you're disrespectfully non-attaching, you're kicking them to the curb.
Yeah.
It's like you recognize that this is something that you shouldn't be doing, and yet here you are doing it. They come back and terrorize you as Tsukumogami.
Well, when I think about people throwing out the letters of their great-grandparents or something, it's like, how do you do that? And yet, at some level, you almost have to.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and going through the supplies of a deceased relative when you don't know, and you do it, but you feel really bad about it.
Yeah.
And sometimes the ritual will help you sort of come to terms with those problems.
It's
You
not.
know, the native Sioux, I lived in South Dakota, and the native Sioux, 1 year to the day after the person has passed away, they have a memory service. And they invite family and friends and everything, and they basically have a funeral all over again. And of course now they've assimilated Christian values, so they have Christian food, but then they have the dinner, and they take all of the belongings of the deceased person that they have held on to for this past year, and they give it away. And if it was like we'll use a man, his favorite shirt, that might go to his closest friend. And as you get out further, well, that was a blanket he sat under every once in a while. That might go to a cousin. But I was fortunate enough to play for a lot of these services, and even though I may not have known the person because they wanted music at the service, they knew I would do that. So I came, and I may or may not have actually known the family well, but there was still something that
For
they
everybody,
felt
right.
I should have for the memory of playing for this service for this person. And a lot of times I had also played the initial funeral, and so it was just kind of, but it's interesting that, you know, we're going to give everything away, everything we own. So now the family, the nucleus family, has nothing of this person. But the extended family and friends have selected items. And so they continue to go, and they continue to grow, and they continue to live, and your memory of that person continues because now you have this item. And I don't know.
My Choctaw friend who got us in so much trouble yesterday, he explained this as a giveaway, and I said, "Oh, you mean a potlatch?" He says, "That's not what it is." He said that, but there are a lot of Native people who are not happy about the way the potlatch got interpreted, and it's a giveaway, and everybody knows how close they were to the person who passed. And he says sometimes you do a giveaway just because you just need to get rid of your stuff and you need to unburden yourself. He said when people are grieving, it's not unusual for them to invite people over for this. So they've lost a child, but they don't give away the things that belong to the child. They give away their own things, right, because they have to make some, I don't know, they have to start over in some way.
Well, and I was always warned, never compliment a native. Oh, I love your earrings.
Because he has to, right. Yeah.
You can
anyway.
say, those look beautiful on you. They compliment you very well. But if you deny, you're going to go home with it.
Yeah.
So.
Can I go back to the evil sword for a minute?
Sure.
Okay. There's because I want to see, because that seems different than some of the other things that you've talked about. That seems like Eliade talks about the transference of like your mana to the object, and so it becomes you, and so that's often you're buried with because it's you, or this, you give it to somebody else because it's you. There's a bunch of horror movies like this, but the only one I can think of is a famous Twilight Zone episode called Dead Man's Shoes, where a guy puts on somebody else's shoes and turns into this gangster. And so the power of this guy's personality is transferred to this guy. And when he takes off the shoes, he's himself again.
I think The Simpsons did a spoof of this one.
Yeah. And there's some horror films that do that too, but I can't think of them now. But I was thinking about the sword. Here you have this evil master who creates this evil sword, and he transfers it to other people. But that's still a kind of soul transfer there. That's not. So that would be different than the one that gets to be 100 years old and develops a soul, right?
Yeah, and part of what I noticed about the Muramasa example is that almost all these other stories of the animated objects, the humans are just sort of there in the background, but this is the one where it's a very specific. That one in Tenjin, who the vengeful deity, who was a human. I don't have a whole lot of examples of people becoming or people transferring parts of their spirit towards it. So he's not putting his spirit in there, but he's making it turn into a bloodthirsty weapon like himself. Tenjin is a human who becomes a kami, who is also vengeful. But those are the only two examples that I really had, because the Tsukumogami are thrown away by this impersonal family in the narrative. And all the other examples that we have are tools of craftsmen who presumably are treating them nice, and venerating them. Muramasa is a craftsman making a very good sword. It just happens to be bloodthirsty, just like him. And one of the examples, one of the narratives that they tell about the difference between a Masamune and a Muramasa sword is, you stick one in the river and a leaf is floating down it, and one of the swords cuts the leaf straight down the middle. And in the other one, the leaf flows around the sword. And the Masamune one is the second one, the highest master, because it cuts what it needs to cut and doesn't cut the sword. Doesn't cut the leaf. The Muramasa, the bloodthirsty one, cuts it clean down the middle. How that is sort of superimposing his psyche on there is something that I would really like to investigate more, especially from my swordsman's background.
Do you know the samurai movie Sword of Doom?
I don't know that
You
one.
have this evil samurai.
You have a really nice collection of movies.
You get him started talking about this, it's going for him.
But it's a really interesting one, because it was supposed to be a trilogy, but it never got made into a trilogy because it was so unpopular because the samurai was so evil. Now I want to go watch it again and see if it's that guy.
It was that guy.
Well, and one of the things that I was thinking of when they're talking about the soul of the samurai for most of the swords, the most famous samurai in all of Japan is Miyamoto Musashi. And I've been recently going through the novelization of Musashi. I've recently retaught the Book of Five Rings in an Introduction to Philosophy class. He never talks about being attached to one single sword, because for him, being a real samurai is being able to pick up any weapon available to hand and to kill your opponent with it. So while everyone else is talking about, Bushido as the sword is your soul, Musashi, who is the highest exemplar, is saying, I should be able to use any weapon that I have, and I am not attached to it in the slightest bit. He's the exception that proves the rule, I guess. And that's part of what's really fascinated me about that. Muramasa imprinting his personality on the sword, and Musashi completely rejecting the soul of the samurai for completely practical reasons. And his biography alone has more fights to the death than anyone else, to the point where in the end he started only dueling people with a wooden sword to challenge himself.
This could go on for a long time.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming to the first session. We reconvene at 2. And so thank you, Kevin.
Thank you all.